You're listening to the Elvis Ultimate Fan Channel podcast, the channel that is devoted 100% to the life and career of the biggest selling recording artist of all time, with your host, Steve Francis.
Hi everyone, welcome to Elvis the Ultimate Fan Channel. My special guest today is Sally Hoedel, a lifelong Elvis fan and historian. Sally also has a degree in journalism from the Michigan State University, and she is the author of a brand new Elvis book, Destined To Die Young. Hi Sally, and welcome to the show.
Hi Steve, thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. Now, one of the first things that strikes me when I see a new book, and probably a lot of Elvis fans as well, would ask why. What inspires this book after all these years and so many Elvis books? So, what is the inspiration for this book that you've written?
It's a big question, and it's multifaceted. I've always been an Elvis fan. Yeah, I've been an Elvis fan since I was 8 or 10 years old, and just consistently throughout my life, really read, whatever came out. Right, whatever came out, I'd get the new book and I'd read it. And I think the thing with Elvis that keeps all of us fans coming back are all the contradictions, right? There's contradictions within Elvis, and then there's also, I think you kind of leave each book maybe with more questions than answers, because he is such a, he's a good guy, he's a Christian, he's a guy who's against smoking and drinking, yet he develops this prescription drug problem. And those kind of contradictions never quite made sense to me. So I think I was just always, looking for those answers and reading more and more. And in recent years, my husband's a little bit older than I am, and his friends in particular, I just think there's always this feedback about Elvis as he was just a guy who took too many pills and he died. And I think his legacy amongst non-Elvis fans has been tarnished by that. And I think in a way that's really unfair, because I personally believe that Elvis's contributions to the world are up there with Henry Ford and Thomas Edison. Like he culturally shifted our American culture for sure, and it reached around the world in a way that has never been done before or since. So I always felt like it was unfair that it was chipped away at with his downfall as opposed to his success, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So you feel there's been injustice and misunderstanding around what killed Elvis Presley. What killed Elvis Presley?
Yeah, I think because so many people look at his story, right, and they see a story of self-destruction, and I've just never seen Elvis that way. I've always seen him as this guy who was struggling to survive.
Mm-hmm.
So when I look at his death, I think for years it was probably in the back of my mind that why did he die such a similar way as Gladys? Mm-hmm. Gladys didn't take the same pills as Elvis took. Yet they died at a very similar age and a very similar, degenerative pattern of about a 4-year health decline. So why is that? And that just kind of always stuck with me. So I'll tell you a quick little story about how it kind of came together initially.
Okay.
So I was 8 or 10 years old, and I'd saved my money, and this was probably, sometime in the 80s when all those new books were coming out on Elvis. And I'd go to the store and I have original copies of Elvis and Me and Elvis and Gladys and several of the books that were coming out. I'd save my money and I'd buy them and I'd read them, even as an 8 and 10-year-old. And I did set my interest in Elvis aside for several years just because, I went to college in the 90s and there weren't a lot of Elvis fans. So, it wasn't something I connected with people in my age group. So I would set it aside. I was always a fan, but it wasn't something I talked about. And, you go to college, you start your career, get married, have kids, all of that. And always a fan, but I had kind of set it aside. My sister was also a big Elvis fan, and she passed away a few years ago. And when we were cleaning out her stuff, she had all of my old Elvis books that I had bought as an 8 and 10-year-old. So I rediscovered all those books, and one of them was Elvis and Gladys by Elaine Dundee. I don't know if you've read that or not.
Yes. I have, yeah.
So I got that book back, and I remember as an 8-year-old just struggling to read it because it's a little bit more complicated subject. It's not just the rise to fame and the women and the rock and roll and all that stuff that's fun to read about. It was a lot of ancestry and that kind of thing. So as an 8-year-old, I struggled to read it. And when I got it back, a few years ago, I sat down and I read it in a day. And it was just kind of my aha moment of discovering in that book that Elvis's maternal grandparents were first cousins. Mm-hmm. And I just, that thought just sat with me for a long time. Like, what if that's the answer? What if that is why Elvis has all of these health problems? Maybe this is why he dies in a similar way as his mother. And maybe the prescription medication was a self-medicating kind of situation. Mm-hmm. So it just started with that idea. And I started to research, and I started to find more and more things that really supported my idea. And then, it comes back to the whole thing I started with, where I feel like Elvis is not held in the high enough esteem as he should be, given his contributions. And again, he's more, noted oftentimes for like this, he's become an image, right? His humanity has been chipped away at. And I say all the time that Elvis is as recognizable worldwide as Coca-Cola and Mickey Mouse. But the difference is that Elvis was a real person. He was a human being. Yeah. And I think his image is so big that we've forgotten that as a society, as a culture.
Yeah, and I was struck by something. I think I read it. I think I read that he's one of the few people as well that can be instantly recognizable just by his first name. He doesn't need his surname. That's just how great, that's how famous he is.
It's huge. It's huge. Yeah. So you're just piecing those two things together of the why. Why did this guy develop this problem? Because it doesn't make sense to me that he did. This guy who's against, he even tells one of the guys, I'm against drinking because I don't ever want to be out of control of myself. And he didn't like seeing his relatives drink because they were out of control of themselves. So it doesn't add up that he would start taking tons of pills all the time and want to be out of control of himself. So I don't believe that Elvis took medication initially. It did become a problem, and I'm not sugarcoating that. My book doesn't sugarcoat it. But he took medication so that he could continue being Elvis Presley. Mm-hmm. And he didn't take medication. His goal was not to escape reality, and that's the definition of an addict, someone who takes a lot of medication to escape reality. That's more of an addict. He was taking a lot of medication to try to function within his world.
Yeah, well, something that struck me when I was reading your book was a line that says, the Elvis of 1957 had the same underlying health problems as the Elvis of 1977. So, people seem to remember the decline from sort of like 1975 to 77 as when he had all the problems.
Right.
But that sentence in your book there leads me to believe that these problems were genetic, and he had these problems from birth.
Absolutely. And I think that's part of the thing that makes it so fascinating for humans, right? Is that you see this Elvis of 1957 who's absolutely perfect, looks like no one has ever looked before.
Yeah.
And then he has this degenerative pattern that leaves him this 42-year-old that looks very different. So visually, I can see why that image and that pattern has stuck in people's heads. But it's what happened in between there, and really even before 1957, that is the real story. Because yes, it is. I believe my book points out that much of it was genetic, much of it was out of his control. So if there are 11 systems in the body, Elvis had disease and disorder by 1977 in 9 of them. Mm-hmm. And my book lays out that 5 of them I have proven were there since birth and very early on, and certainly before fame, which is the most important thing, because what is it everybody always talks about, right? Like Elvis has all these problems, and a lot of fans know about what his health ailments were. It's not normal for a 35 to 40-year-old to have glaucoma and diabetes and hypertension and arthritis, severe arthritis. These are not normal ailments for a 35 to 40-year-old man, but they always got excused away as, well, it must have been caused by all that drug use.
Yeah.
And again, there's more to that story, and that's what this book explores.
Yeah, I mean, let's just touch on you touched on a few things there that the problems he had. I mean, he had circulatory problems, his lungs, mm-hmm. The respiratory system, his digestive system. You mentioned the glaucoma in the eyes.
Right.
Also, there was insomnia, acute insomnia.
Yeah. And insomnia from a very early age, which is a nervous system condition.
Yeah, no, exactly. Because
and again, modern Americans tend to think like, oh, if you can get by on no sleep, that's great because you can produce even more. You can do even more. But it's not normal to not sleep, and our bodies need sleep to heal.
oh yes,
So,
yes, it's very important.
insomnia is a real issue.
Yeah, because again, you see, people seem to think that his insomnia stemmed from when he was famous, but in your book, you say no, from a very early age, he was an insomniac.
Very early, and everyone, it's in almost everyone's book confirming that, saying Elvis, always talked about how he couldn't sleep as a teenager, and then to go back and read someone's book like, Maxine Brown, who was part of the Browns, the country group that toured with Elvis, and 54 or 55 in the very early days. Elvis had stayed at their house in Arkansas, I believe, on the way back from one of their tours, and Mrs. Brown, the mother of the trio, said, he like tore up the sheets. He was moving all night long. He just does not sleep. And everyone knew that to be true. Scotty Moore talked about it a lot. They'd get back in the car during those early days after a show, and he wouldn't sleep. He would be fidgeting and talking all night long. It would get to the point where they'd pull over and let him walk around for a while just so they could drive in peace, perhaps,
Yeah. And also
So,
it's well
always a problem.
it's well documented as well that he was a sleepwalker.
Mm-hmm.
Which again is bad for sleep, because when you're sleepwalking, obviously you're not getting the proper rest you should be.
Correct. So he never got a restful sleep, and we see that in 1973 after his October hospital stay. Dr. Nick really wants to see if he can get him to reach a state of restful sleep without any medication. So after he was in the hospital for 2 weeks in October, he's not on any medication at all, and goes back to Graceland, and Dr. Nick says, we're going to see, let's try to get you to sleep, no medication. And it was 72 hours. Elvis was wide awake.
Wow. 72 hours is a
that
long time.
72 hours.
Wow.
And that was a real realization for Dr. Nick, too, that he could not sleep without medication. And you have to remember, too, one of the other issues, and I know I'm jumping around a lot because there's just so much information in this book, but you have to remember, too, that Ambien and, Lunesta, those kind of prescription medications for insomnia or, interrupted sleep, they didn't exist then. So Dr. Nick had to use things like Valium and other things that develop over time a tolerance. So he'd have to take more to get sleep.
Okay, so can we just one of the other things I want to touch on as well actually is the the problem he had with his digestion and the megacolon. We understand that was a very serious problem, not just for Elvis, but for the Presleys and the Smiths. In fact, Lisa Marie is actually when she was interviewed by Oprah, she actually mentioned that it was a problem for all the Presleys.
Yeah, she described it as a chronic situation.
Yeah.
So yes, and I've traced it to other people in the Presley family as well. Sal Presley, cousin of Vernon's, he died of digestive problems, in his 30s. And Valeria Presley, she also died of some type of intestinal problem, and again in her 30s. So something definitely going on, on that side of the family with that problem. And with Elvis, what really was, I had someone quoted that had lived in Lauderdale courts saying that Elvis was, I think he wasn't well liked by this guy, and this guy described him as like a pimple-faced kid who, always had to go to the bathroom and couldn't, right?
Oh, right.
So I had that confirmed that he had constipation issues in Lauderdale court, but that was the earliest known confirmation until I did this book. And Annie Presley, who was cousin of Vernon through marriage, she was married to Sal Presley. She confirmed that Gladys had such trouble trying to get dealing with Elvis's constipation when he was a very young child, a toddler and into childhood. And she tried milk and magnesia and all of these things, and she would have to, manually help him to have a bowel movement because he had such constipation problems. So, Dr. Nick, in his book, he went with the idea that he believed Elvis probably suffered from Hirschsprung's disease, and I think that's absolutely true. I think there's so much evidence of it, and what that means is that the end of his colon wouldn't have been fully wired with nerves, so the end part of his colon never worked properly.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and again, over
when,
the years, people have pointed to
yes.
his drug abuse as causing that. But if he had this problem so far back at Lauderdale courts before he even started taking medication, then it's completely false. It's completely false.
It's completely false. It's completely false. And many of the medications he took would have slowed down the digestive system. So it doesn't do him any favors when he already has this problem. But he had such an extreme problem, and that's why I say that in 1957, Elvis is just as sick as he is in 77, even if he doesn't look it, because he would have had extreme constipation problems even in 1957. And it would have caused an extreme amount of pain. And in my opinion, that's why he turns to the prescription medication. Because, everybody knows what it's like to have a stomach ache for a day or two. Can you imagine 20, 30 years?
Yeah.
And when, you get to the autopsy results and you start looking at that, and he has, fecal material in his colon that is 4 months old.
Yeah, it's a chronic issue, isn't it?
It's a huge chronic problem. It is, and it can become toxic, and it can create all sorts of infection problems, which it did for Elvis, because you need to move waste throughout your body at a particular pace and rate, or it will become an issue, and it did for him, and it's part of the reason he was dealing with all this infection issue during the last 10 years of his life as well. But you cannot discount the pain that would have been caused by this. I was just going to say that there's two illustrations of a normal colon and a megacolon in my book, and you can even, you can Google it and you can look at a real one, on YouTube, and it just makes you realize how much pain he would have been in, and it is not just when he's bloated at the end and you can tell he has issues. It's long before that, and we have proof of that because I think it's 1971, 72, somewhere in there, where he writes the TCB oath, right? Which most fans have read. And it's mostly karate driven and, goals and things like that. But at the end, he says freedom from constipation.
Yes. Yeah.
In that TCB oath. So if you put the time that he wrote that as the visual of that's the way it is, where he's in the white jumpsuit and he's doing it's a very physical, active concert, right?
Yes.
When you watch that concert.
Yeah.
And he's doing karate moves and everything, he had serious constipation issues to the point where he wrote it down in an oath.
Yeah.
And I think we can all imagine the kind of pain that would have caused and the kind of medication that would have been necessary to perform like that over that pain.
Yes, I agree. You also said that he had infection issues as well. He suffered from tonsillitis a lot of the time, but they wouldn't be removed because nobody could guarantee his voice after the operation. In fact,
right.
Lisa Marie had hers taken out.
Yes, and he always felt glad, that he could have. Part of his prescription medication problem too is he saw his access to healthcare as success. Because so he was so proud and pleased that Lisa Marie could have that surgery and have her tonsils removed. Because as a child, and I talk about it in the book too, where in 30s and 40s Tupelo, parents lived in fear that their child would have something really wrong with them because they knew they couldn't afford the medical care to help them. So Elvis has bouts of tonsillitis as a child, and they're severe. To the point where Vernon said they thought they were going to lose him once or twice because his fever would be so high. And even if he should have had them out as a child, they never would have been able to afford that surgery or that care. And, Guy Harris, when I interviewed him, he attested to that too. He said, if we had anything, and we had stuff, but boy, you just got through it and you moved forward because there wasn't money or time to do anything else. So Elvis has tonsillitis as a child. We have records of it when he's in the Army. It's in his Army records. It plagues him throughout his life. And he never has them. Once he becomes famous, he doesn't want to have the tonsils removed because he doesn't want to hurt his voice. That's absolutely true. But they say his tonsils were so bad, they had holes in them.
Wow.
Towards the end there.
Wow.
So that's how they're described. And that's just from chronic infection.
Yeah, well, when I was younger, I had very, very bad tonsillitis, so I can sort of be sympathetic to what he went through. It can be extremely, extremely bad. And I think Gladys and Vernon said prayers, and the next morning his fever broke. But it was that close, that almost as a last resort. The doctors had given up, and they prayed to God, and he came through. So
absolutely, and Elvis in some records, are quotes are just, he's described as a child as having, a low appetite, just never gaining weight. His fever always ran high. I think it might have been Annie Press that said something like that. His fever, he always had a high temperature. So something, I believe he was immunocompromised from the very beginning. We know from his autopsy that he had something called hypogammaglobulinemia. And what that is, it's an immune system problem where your body doesn't make enough antibodies to fight infection. And it's most common that you see it with things like pneumonia, meningitis, and tonsillitis. So we know that we know that he had that from the autopsy, and then you can connect it and you can see it throughout his life. And the funny thing is that before the Army, there wouldn't be any medical records for Elvis, right? Because they really couldn't afford a lot of health care. No one's writing down every time he has a fever or he's sick because he's not famous. And then in the Army, we have medical records that show that he's having these problems. And then again, from the Army until he starts having being treated by Dr. Nick, there's no records again. But then when he's treated by Dr. Nick, and again, not everything's written down because they're not typical office visits where records are kept. But when Dr. Nick becomes his doctor, then we see again record of pretty consistent infection throughout his life. So we see it whenever it's recorded, but we have to be cognizant of the fact that it wasn't recorded, for big periods of time because he wasn't famous, basically, or because he didn't have a steady doctor in the 60s. So it doesn't mean it didn't happen, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Now, I have to say that, I agree 100% with what you're saying. Elvis probably wasn't destined to live to be old because of these pre-existing problems, but also his lifestyle didn't help. His eating habits was high fat, high carbohydrate, inadequate sleep. We've already touched on that, haven't we? So, on top of all that as well, he had those problems where he had a unique lifestyle. There was no blueprint for somebody being as famous as Elvis. I mean, exactly. Elvis was the first rock star. And the bar is set by everybody comparing themselves to Elvis Presley. He was the first, so there was no blueprint for being Elvis Presley. So on top of all these health problems that he also had this unique lifestyle of being Elvis. So that wouldn't have helped. That wouldn't have helped.
You're absolutely. Oftentimes with Elvis, and I describe it probably 4 or 5 times with different situations in the book, as you know, there's a double whammy type of situation. Where two things come together that are both really bad. So we know he had that hypogammaglobulinemia, where his body does not make enough antibodies to properly fight infection. He has low T cells. We know that was the case. And then on top of it, because of his fame, he decides it's easier to live at night. And one of those reasons was because it was very hard for him to be rude to fans. He didn't want to tell anyone no. So when he went out at night, he didn't have to. It was just easier for it to exist. But what happens when you live at night? I mean, without question, Elvis had to have vitamin D deficiency, correct?
Yes, because of the lack of sunlight. Yeah.
A lack of sunlight. And in the 70s, the 50s, 60s, 70s, no one took supplements of vitamin D. No one heard of that yet. No one did that. And I've confirmed that, with Tish, his nurse. No one took vitamin D supplements. And then he's living at night. And then he has an immune system that doesn't work. So it's a double whammy for the immune system. Because as we're hearing even more today, that the best way to not get COVID is to have your vitamin D levels up where they should be. Because you have a 70% increased risk if you have low vitamin D, they say.
Yeah.
So think about that, what that would have done to Elvis when his body can't fight infection like it should. And then he has no sun exposure, or very little. Yeah.
So what I say is correct. On top of all the health problems he had as well, the lifestyle he had wasn't good either. It didn't help matters.
Yeah, and I agree. But the other thing to consider, though, there's a lot of myths surrounding the way he ate, in my opinion. Did he love to indulge? Yes. Did he love rich foods? Absolutely. But his early years, it was mostly vegetables that he ate because meat was too expensive. And you see that even when, if you read Nick Adams' book, when he goes to see Elvis and his family, and when he visits them at the Audubon house, it's a lot of sliced tomatoes and peas and corn, because that was what they were used to eating. And that stays a staple in Elvis's diet as well. And all of his food is made there at Graceland. You know, it's not processed food. Is it cooked in fat? Absolutely. But there is a lot of myth associated with that. So people would say, you know, yeah, he would order this huge breakfast, but he never ate all of it. He just liked knowing that he could order it. And Linda Thompson confirms that. He'd say, well, I was poor and I couldn't afford anything, so now this is the breakfast I order, even if I'm not going to eat it, because I like that I can order it, you know. So there is a lot of that. And Ron Strauss also broke a huge myth, and I think it's one of the biggest stories that has contributed to this overeating, you know, idea of Elvis always being indulgent. And the story of the Fool's Gold sandwich in Colorado, how the story has always been that Elvis just got on the Lisa Marie and they flew out to Colorado and they bought this huge, you know, sandwich, like a jar of peanut butter on each one. It's bacon, pound of bacon. And that story has always been used to say, gosh, Elvis was such a glutton, he was so indulgent. Well, Ron Strauss, one of Elvis's pilots of the Lisa Marie, has told us recently that it was Lisa Marie's birthday. And they were taking her back to California, back to be with Priscilla. And they stopped for those sandwiches so it would be fun for her and her birthday.
Yeah.
And they cut them up on the plane and they handed them out, you know.
Yeah. I mean, also, he wasn't on his own. He wasn't eating all it. He had the entourage as well that were eating it. You know, there could have been 15 other people eating it. So, but of course, it doesn't make such a sensationalistic story. You know, the papers. It doesn't sell as well if you say, you know, the truth. So just you mentioned Ron Strauss there, his pilot. You also spoke to Barbara Hearn Smith, who dated him in 1956. You spoke to Marion Koch and Tish Henley Kirk as well, didn't you? Yes.
Yep. Guy Harris.
Oh yeah, boyhood friend Guy Harris. Yeah.
Yeah, I was fortunate to speak with him because he passed recently, and I spent a day with him, and it was just so enjoyable. And then several other people in Tupelo, you know, his cousin, Lee Clark.
Oh, yeah.
And Azalea Smith Moore. So some of the people that maybe haven't been looked at as sources as often, but they were filled with information about what it would be like to grow up in Tupelo and all of that. So, yeah, super fortunate to talk to all of those people.
I spoke to Barbara Hearn Smith a few months ago for my podcast, and I was blown away. Such a beautiful woman, inside and out. Really, you know, she was I was just blown away. Lovely woman.
Absolutely, I was able to meet with her in Tennessee in person. Did all my interviews in person, actually, and I sat down with her and her husband, and it was just such a nice time, a nice conversation. They're lovely. Her husband has a great story too, you know, because he was in the CIA. So both really fascinating people. They've had a great life. I really enjoyed connecting with Tish Henley Kirk. Just incredibly knowledgeable and close with Elvis, and really able to share a lot of that health perspective with me and lead me in the right direction. And you know, we both agree that Elvis did have a problem, but why? So she was just really helpful. You know, on that quest.
Now we also we can't not mention his relationship with Colonel Parker, and
sure.
People are divided. Some people say that he overworked Elvis. Other people say, well, Elvis had to work to keep everybody paid. What's your opinion on Colonel Parker?
Well, you know, this book really, I didn't know that I would develop an opinion or really find an answer for myself anyway in understanding that relationship, but I did. It came along with this process of studying Elvis so closely. And I will say, though, first of all, and I say it in my conclusion, that I don't believe there are villains and heroes in this story. And I know, like you said, people are split, right? And they've decided who the villains are and who the heroes are. Yes. And I don't think that's our job. I mean, we weren't there, and these were real people. We can provide some analysis and maybe even some insight because they were so close. Maybe we would see something that they didn't see. But to categorize people like that, I think, is wrong because it was real life, and these were real people.
Yes.
So, and we'll never know the full truth, no matter what, right? And each person involved has a different version of the truth because it's their own version, because it was their life. They lived it.
Yeah.
Having said that, there is so much controversy and so much disagreement around the Colonel, but by understanding Elvis as a provider, which I lay out throughout my book. Elvis was not driven to be this rock and roll star in the beginning. He was driven to provide for his parents.
Mm-hmm.
That was his only goal. And it remains his goal. And it's why in the 70s, when he is so sick and should not be working anymore, he keeps working because he has even more people to take care of. It grew far beyond Vernon and Gladys. So when I see Elvis as this provider and that being his only goal, then it makes sense to me that he put the colonel in charge of providing the money, basically. So the colonel's job is to make the money. And Elvis knows that. And I believe he agrees to that in 1956. He knows that the colonel's a lot more shrewd than him. Elvis is this guy who's so polite, right? And he's yes, sir, no, ma'am, always treats the little people as good as the same as big people, treats everyone the same, a good guy. And he gets paired with this man who doesn't even have the ability to say hello and goodbye and thank you most of the time. Right? That doesn't make sense. When you think of someone you're going to spend a lot of time with, you want to have similar personalities probably, right? But I think that Elvis chooses the colonel because he sees the fact that the colonel is focused on money. Everybody knows that. No one disputes that. His job is to make the money, and he's good at it. And I think that's the agreement that Elvis comes to with himself as well when it comes to the colonel. To me, it just helped explain that relationship to me because I've never had peace with that. I've never understood it. But for me, that settled it for me, is that their relationship was by design. So that Elvis could provide for his family because the colonel was good at making money. And Elvis is not driven by money, and we know that. He's so generous. He doesn't save it like he should. He spends it like he shouldn't. But he knows he needs it in order to be that provider that he prides himself on being.
Yeah, I mean, I've often thought Elvis's fame surprised himself in the end. I don't think he really believed he would get as big as he did. As you say, I think he just thought he'd put a roof over his mum and dad's head. They'd have some cars. His mother would never have to work again. His father would never have to work again. But then it just skyrocketed out of control. He just became this huge megastar. And I was struck. I spoke to his co-star, Cynthia Pepper, co-star of Kissing Cousins a few weeks ago. And she told me a story about how they were waiting to film a scene. They were sat in a Jeep and he turned to her and said, he says, Cynthia, I don't even know what I'm doing here. He says, I should be driving a truck. He was still, she said, she felt that he was still that truck driver. He wasn't this big star. He wasn't this Elvis Presley. And he actually said that at times, didn't he? He says, the image is one thing and the human being is another. It's very hard to live up to an image. And there definitely was two Elvis Presleys. There was the image, and then there was just the country boy from Tupelo.
I agree with that, but at the same time, I'm not sure they're so far apart because everybody would say he'd get nervous being on stage, but he was just him. Like there weren't, it was just Elvis was so real and he was so genuine. I do think though that like the clothes and the hair and all of that did become the image, right? Because he was just this poor kid from Tupelo. So I think both of those statements are oddly true at the same time.
Yeah.
You know, because he was so genuine and everybody says so. Like he didn't go to a movie set with a big ego and act like he wanted to be treated differently than everyone. He wanted to be treated like anyone else.
Yeah.
He says that to his maid. He used to have that great conversation with Nancy, his maid, and I think she was calling him Mr. Presley, and he was like, I don't want that here. I want to come home. I don't want to be a rock star. I want to just relax at my house.
Yeah.
And she said, well, how about I treat you like my brother? And he's like, that would be perfect. So even the people that he's paying, to clean his house or cook, he still wants to be on the same level as them. And I just think it's because he was a decent person.
Yeah.
He was a decent human being, and he stayed a decent human being. So we can talk about how fame was such a toll for him. And it was. I think he's always conflicted by being Elvis, the person his parents raised him to be, and Elvis, the famous guy. Because fame brought things into his life that he never thought he'd have to choose, right? He never thought he'd have to make those big decisions that fame and money brought. He never thought. So when it does happen, he doesn't always make the right decision. But he's always conflicted between being those two people, but at the same time, he remains this generous, decent person, really throughout his life. And everybody, who was saying recently, I think someone was telling me about the person who wrote the recent book on him being in Vegas, and the author was looking for someone who had something bad to say about Elvis, and he couldn't find anybody who had anything bad to say about Elvis. The people who have met him, they all speak highly.
Yeah,
and,
it does.
And that says something.
Yeah, I think credit should go to Vernon and Gladys for the upbringing as well.
Without question, we are all a product of our parents. We're all a product of our upbringing, both good and bad. And Gladys said, she's quoted many times as saying, success for me is seeing that he knows how to treat people and that he's respectful and that he has integrity.
Yeah.
That meant more to her than the money and the records and the fame.
So this leads us to this amazing life coming to an end in August 1977. Most, as you say, a lot of people just say, oh, well, he died in his bathroom through prescription drug abuse and overeating and all this. But it couldn't be further from the truth, really, could it? Because what you say in your book is that it's to do with the colon problem and something called, is it the Valsalva Maneuver?
It is, I always say it wrong, Valsalva Maneuver.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that is what it comes down to. And let's talk about that in a minute, because we really haven't talked about where it all started. And the first chapter of my book is very ancestry driven, which a lot of people might not expect, right?
Yeah, okay.
Because it's a health book. And in writing this book, I was concerned. I know Elvis fans don't want to read a science book. I don't want to read a science book. So I didn't want to bog them down in too much of that. And I wanted to tell the story of Elvis and intertwine that disease and where it comes from, throughout the story. So to keep it interesting. And then, of course, I also hope that non-Elvis fans read it. But his end really does start at the beginning. And it starts with his ancestors and how I was able to trace, especially his other, the other inherited disorder that we know undoubtedly he had was the alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. And I traced that because we know he was a carrier. We can trace it to Gladys and then on to Gladys's mother. And we can talk about that a little bit if you want to. But all of these problems that culminate in 77, they all started, long before. And it makes that the Valsalva Maneuver, which we'll talk about, the fact that is most likely what stopped his heart, that is so related to his colon problem. It's related to the liver problem. It's related to the heart problem. And that all makes it a genetic occurrence.
Okay. All right. So this alpha 1 then, if you can just outline exactly what that problem is. Yeah.
Well, let me tell you what it is, and then we can trace it. For me, that was kind of the starting point of realizing the major thing that was most obviously wrong in this family, because we have to figure out what killed Gladys to really understand Elvis's health problems too, and all of Gladys's siblings. So we know that Elvis was a carrier for alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. And again, for decades, it's been written off because he was just a carrier. Well, through my research, I have found that it is undoubtedly, it's one of the few genetic diseases that as a carrier, you can still be affected by. So what alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency is your liver makes a protein and it leaves your liver and it goes to your lungs to protect them. If you have what's most common for a carrier is the lung problem. So that means that you have deficiency and you're not making enough of that protein, so you don't get all that protection in your lungs. So you end up, it can lead to needing a lung transplant. It can be that bad. It's often misdiagnosed as COPD. We see Elvis doing an inhaler in one of his concert documentaries before he goes on stage.
Yep.
We know he had breathing problems. We know he was diagnosed with COPD, so we have to believe that's the alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency being present in lung form. Now, it can also impact your liver, which I believe it did with Gladys, because if you have that protein being made in your liver and it's misshaped because you have this genetic condition, then it gets trapped in your liver and it can't leave, and it leads to hepatitis, fatty liver, and then cirrhosis. So I outline in the book that is most likely what caused Gladys's demise. And we can trace it up the maternal side of the tree because Gladys's mother, So that first cousin marriage between Bob and Dal Smith, which are Elvis's maternal grandparents, Dal Smith in 1904 has her first child, and she takes to her bed for 30 years. And she has 8 more children. But she is said to have tuberculosis. And, it's very uncommon to live for 30 years with tuberculosis in the early 1900s. It was like 5 years was a long time. So she lived for 30 years, continues to have children, and living in a sharecropper's cottage, I suppose, close proximity with a lot of people. No one else catches tuberculosis, which is the most contagious disease, spread through droplets in the air and whatnot. So the fact that no one caught it, I think we can assume she was misdiagnosed. So she dies of what looks like a lung disease, like tuberculosis, in 30 years. I would say it's alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, because we know Elvis had it and it had to come from somewhere. And then Gladys would be more likely to have that liver problem because she would have inherited 2 bad genes, one from each parent, because her parents were so closely related. Okay. So inheriting 2 bad genes is much worse than inheriting 1 bad gene, if that makes it more sensible. So Elvis would have inherited 1 bad gene, but Gladys would have inherited 2, and that's how, that she has even more liver dysfunction and lung dysfunction. But Elvis had fatty liver and liver dysfunction too, which again can be attributed to the prescription drug use. But there was something else going on there too, which is why he dies so early. And another thing to line up is the Memphis Mafia guys, right? They have all said we were taking the same drugs. We were young, so as Joe Esposito says, but we were young, so we could do it. Well, Elvis was young too. Yet all the other guys live to be 70 and 80 for the most part, and Elvis doesn't. And they're all eating the same bad food, and they're all taking the same pills, to get through the night and the day and all that.
Yeah, they're keeping the same hours as Elvis as well. Yeah.
Same hours, same lifestyle, same food, and same pills. Sonny West, Joe Esposito, they've all been quoted as saying we all took the uppers and downers, and we lived hard for a long time, but we were young and we could do it. I mean, that was the quote from Joe Esposito, and I would just argue that Elvis was young too. Why couldn't he? And it has to do with a lot of things came down from that first cousin marriage with the doubling of the gene pool, and you just, as a male especially, which I explain in my book, you're much more likely to inherit any bad genes because you only get 1 X chromosome where females get 2. And you can see that in Gladys's family because her 4 brothers, I think it's 3 or 4 brothers, her 3 brothers all died very young, between 45 and 55. And it's because the males are more likely to inherit these problems. And there's definitely a heart problem. Her brother, Tracy, Travis, they have had they had stroke and heart attack in their 40s.
Very young.
Even if it wasn't the instance that killed them, even before they had died of similar attacks, they had other heart attacks and strokes in their 40s that I found record of. So that's not normal. And then when you add that to Elvis having this heart episode through the, what the latest theory is, the Valsalva Maneuver, it's more believable, more plausible, more compounded by the fact that all these males on his mother's side of the family also die of sudden heart situations.
So can we now just discuss then what actually happened on the morning stroke afternoon of August the 16th? There's a assumption that it was a drugs overdose that killed Elvis. Some people have said that. Now, the position of Elvis's body leads us to believe that he stood up, took a couple of steps, and then fell forward. Now, if it's a drug overdose, you slowly slip into a coma. You don't stand up and walk and then fall. So
it's a slow death too.
Yeah, exactly.
It's slow. Exactly. You kind of fall into slumber, and slowly die. Yeah.
It's all indications that his death came very swiftly.
Correct. It was definitely a heart episode. There have been many experts that have said so. Even in 1994, I believe it was the state of Tennessee opened it up again and had this renowned medical examiner look at the case. He was the medical examiner for JFK and for MLK. And he looked at it in 1994 and said, without a doubt, Elvis died of a heart episode. Some people can say, well, the drugs brought on the heart attack. I would just say there's tons of evidence proving otherwise. And the overdose theory just doesn't hold up at all, in my opinion, because like you said, he stumbled forward, died rather quickly of a heart attack, cardiac arrhythmia. And it wasn't a slow death like drugs would bring on. But also keep in mind that the things that he took that night were the things he took every night.
Yes.
In the amounts that he always took them. So why would they kill him on that night and not any other night?
Well, you see, that is the red herring, isn't it? It's the 10 drugs that were found. I think it's 10 drugs that were found in his system. The one thing that's always a little bit confusing is there was a high level of codeine in his bloodstream. Correct. I think it was 10 times the therapeutic level.
Well, and it was morphine that was found because codeine gets changed into, it appears as morphine. Yeah. And yeah, there was codeine. So that's always been another one of those theories or conspiracies. But we know for sure that Elvis took codeine lots of times before that night. Yeah. We have, two prescriptions that were written in the 60s for codeine that Elvis got and took. He found out in the Army, we know from his medical records that he found out then that he was allergic to codeine. So he knew he was allergic, and he still got prescriptions filled for it on multiple occasions. And Linda Thompson wrote in her book that, yes, Elvis knew he was allergic, and he would take it, and he would get a little itchy, but that was it. Yeah. And you have to remember, too, Elvis he's taking antihistamine every day. So that might have also knocked down some of those allergic reactions within his body too. Yeah.
He was only mildly allergic, as you say. It caused him to itch.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, and they also said, the guy who did the examination on the autopsy said that they checked the larynx for swelling because that would be the number one sign of an allergic reaction to a drug, and there was none.
Yeah. Unfortunately, codeine actually causes constipation, so that would have actually compounded his problem he had with his colon as well. So all these things.
And he got it from the dentist. He got it from the dentist that night. Yeah. So it was I don't think it was something he took all the time, but he took it that night for whatever reason. But we know he took it lots of times before that. So, I wouldn't say that was a factor. As far as the 10 drugs in his system, it's really interesting. Again, there's so much contradiction with Elvis. Most people, even the 2020, show that Geraldo did in 78, 79, I'm not sure what year it was. He only talked about the toxicology report from the Bioscience Laboratory in California, which their conclusion was Elvis died from polypharmacy. And polypharmacy just means you're taking more than a few prescriptions, a few drugs. And there was another lab, which, I talk about in my book, and it's well documented. It was the Center for Human Toxicology out of the University of Utah. They also did an analysis, and they said their conclusion was that all the drugs were there for a medical reason and in therapeutic range, and that he did not die from drugs. So even immediately after he dies, when all studies are being done, those two studies, they come up with totally opposite conclusions. And it's part of the thing that has hurt Elvis's legacy, right? There's so much contradiction. There's never a clear-cut answer, it seems. Yeah. Two labs get totally different, totally different perspective. And like you said, I think a lot of that does circle back to he's this wholesome, decent guy, raised in Tupelo, and then he's this famous rock star that he never anticipated he would be. And there's just some personal conflict, I think, from those two, the divergent, paths of those two.
Yeah. So it was a cardiac event that finished Elvis's life.
Yeah, I think, several people have said this. It's not just me. Most of what is in my book has been said before. I'm just connecting it in a different way. Yes. Yeah. That it, that makes a logical sense. And one of the things that has been said before, Dr. Nick touched on it in his book. And then, again, the medical examiner that I believe he did, he was the forensics, guy when Princess Diana passed and several other high profile people. It was his opinion too, that it's probably something called the Valsalva Maneuver that ultimately killed Elvis. And what that means is anytime you strain, whether it's to go to the bathroom or in childbirth, you're increasing pressure in your abdomen and chest, and that puts a different kind of strain. It changes the blood flow. So if you already have a problem with your heart not, pumping blood like it should, and your liver is not cleaning blood like it should, and all your blood goes through the liver and back to the heart, Elvis had problems with his heart and his liver. So when blood's not transferring like it should between those organs, and then you're straining, it can change just for a moment the blood flow and the pressure throughout the body, and it can cause a heart attack. So it makes sense, that this would happen to Elvis because we know he's on the toilet when he, passes away, unfortunately. And we know that's where he had his cardiac event. So we also know Dr. Nick has been quoted as saying that Elvis would have been trying extra hard to clear his bowels that day because he knew he was going on tour.
Yeah.
And he didn't want to look as bloated. So he always did that. He always tried harder, to go to the bathroom before he went on tour. So it makes sense that here it is, he's straining even harder than normal, and then he has this cardiac event that's tied to it.
Okay. And
Dan Warlick, who was one of the investigators, that was his theory pretty early on, and it was kind of dismissed. He had told the 2020 investigators, that were looking into it, that was his theory, and they dismissed it. And then, long and behold, all this time later, that's what the experts are saying probably killed him.
Yeah, I read that book years ago. It was called The Death of Elvis, wasn't it, I think?
Right, yeah.
And I agreed with that conclusion all those years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And as you quite rightly said, a lot of this stuff is already known. It's already been said. But your book is just tying it all up and making all sense out of it.
Exactly. So when Dan Warlick says it when that book came out a long time ago, and he's dismissed by the other guys, no, he was killed, drugs killed him, it wasn't the Valsalva Maneuver or his heart, blah, blah, blah. He's dismissed. But now we have more experts saying it was most likely that, knowing that Elvis had Hirschsprung's disease, which is a genetic, congenital disorder, knowing that he had that constipation problem from birth, it all leads to his untimely death. And it's just pieced together in a way that now makes sense, in my opinion.
I truly hope that your book kind of clarifies it a little bit better and sort of gets rid of a lot of the myths surrounding Elvis's death. As you say, he was a drug addict, he was hopelessly addicted, he ate 20 hamburgers every day and all this and all that. Just all that complete and utter rubbish. There's
so much, and as Elvis fans, I don't think we even realize how much of that is out there, right? Because we all look for the truth, we all look for the humanity, we all look to the man and his story and the people that surrounded him and look for the truth in that. But we forget that there's a lot of non-Elvis fans out there, the people who just know who he was. They wouldn't call themselves a fan or have much knowledge of him beyond that. And those myths are so embraced and accepted by a lot of people, so than we realize. I think
they're deeply ingrained, and they're just just rehashed over time and time again. And and these articles normally they're accompanied by an unflattering Elvis at the end of his life, when obviously he was ill and he was struggling with his health. So and it's just And the articles come back around, as fans, we know, because we read the stuff, when it's his death date or his birthday week, the articles come around and they're on a national level and they're in all these different publications. And they mostly talk about how much he ate and all the women and how he died in the bathroom. I just think that's incredibly sad because Elvis truly shifted our culture in a way that had never been done before. Yes. And
I understand it's just music and that's seen as entertainment, but it's really no different than what Henry Ford did when he made the car affordable for everyone. It shifted the whole universe.
Yes.
So it's just too bad that so many people only know the negative myths that really aren't even wholly true.
And as you say in your book, you feel that Elvis deserves the truth to be known about his health issues and how he died at such an early age.
He deserves it. And I think, the funny thing, the odd thing is that the fact that all this has been buried for so long is partly by his own design, because he wanted to be this strong American male. This was a different time when you couldn't show weakness, and he's surrounded by all these guys all the time. So there's even more pressure to be that strong male, and he's everyone's boss. You have to remember that too.
Yeah.
To us, he's Elvis, but to everyone in his world, he was the boss, like the guy in charge. So, and he knew that, and he had to play that role all the time. So he couldn't just be like, oh, I'm so constipated today, like that wasn't going to happen, because he was the strong man. So he hid all of his ailments for many, many years from everyone. I think his nurse and his doctor were the only two that knew a lot of it up until the end. So when I think it's hard for some of the guys who saw him take too much medication sometimes, and they saw the other doctors give him too much medication sometimes, to say that he wasn't just an addict, because that's the part they saw. They weren't there for the time with Dr. Nick when Elvis would be honest about what was ailing him. They didn't know that so much of the medication he was taking had a purpose, whether it was the constipation or the glaucoma or the diabetes, or the hypertension. No one at any given time in Elvis's circle knows 100% of what's going on, and Elvis created it that way so that he could, even in his own inner circle, be this strong man all the time. He did not want to show his weaknesses. He didn't want to show that he had these health problems, and the medication really allowed him to do that. Now, I think the sad part is that now, 40-something years later, would Elvis rather be known as a man who had some illnesses that are out of his control, and he did the best he could to try to live with them and perform through them? Or would he want to be known as the person who was a drug addict? Yes. Now he'd much rather be known as this guy who had some weaknesses and some troubles that were out of his control. But unfortunately, because he hid it so well, all that's been left for decades is the drugs.
Yeah.
And not why he took them.
He had a lot to live up to, and it would have broken lesser men, I believe. It just shows his strength of character that he carried it off for so long.
Without question. And his other why did he do it? Why didn't he just quit? Why didn't he stop touring?
Yeah.
It is because he has to provide for all of those people. He doesn't want anyone to ever go back to the poverty that he came from.
He didn't want to let anybody down either. He never wanted to let his fans down.
Exactly.
There's probably only a handful of times when he was so sick that he had to cancel his concerts.
And he sees, over time, he's also providing for them, right? He sees himself as this provider who has to take care of everyone, and then his fans get added to that. He has to provide for them too. He doesn't want to disappoint them. And then when the touring starts, he has over 100 people on his payroll. So now he's providing jobs and, money and income and for all of those people, and he can't let them down. So it just grows and grows over time how many people Elvis is providing for, and he just feels so responsible in that role. And that is part of what leads to his downfall in health too.
Okay, so the book is called Destined to Die Young, and it's available next month, I believe, Monday, December the 14th, but you can pre-order it now, can't you?
You can pre-order it now so that it'll ship out on the 14th, and hopefully people will get it, especially in the States, in time for Christmas, and I'm not quite sure how long it'll take overseas, but that's the hope, that everything will ship out on the 14th. And we might get a few extra days in there if things go well with the printer, and then it'll definitely get in time for Christmas. But you can absolutely pre-order it on my website.
And tell our listeners what the website is.
It's www.elvisauthor.com.
Okay.
AUTHOR, elvisauthor.com.
Okay, I'll put a link in the description box for the podcast and the YouTube channel as well, and people can just click on that, and it'll take them straight to the website.
Yeah, and I know it's a lot of information. I hope, we're kind of jumping around a lot, and I hope it makes sense to everyone. But it really does start with his ancestry, and then it moves throughout his life. And as you know, because you've read it, there's just a lot in there. And it's hard to explain it all, not in chronological order and have it pieced together. But I promise there is a process there. And I think as you read it, you'll see how all of this fits together over time.
Yeah, well, I was lucky. You forwarded me the manuscript for me to read in advance of this interview. And I'd just like to tell everybody that it is a very, very interesting read, and I would recommend it. And you've done a great job.
Oh, well, thank you for saying that. I'm excited. It's scary to share something that you worked so hard on for so long, but I'm super excited to share it, and I'm anxious to hear, especially what the fans and the people that are so knowledgeable about Elvis, what they think for sure. So I just so appreciate you having me on and discussing it and sharing it with everyone.
Well, thanks for coming on the show.
Sure, thank you.
Thanks once again to Sally for joining me on the show today. Once again, the website to pre-order her book is www.elvisauthor.com. You can contact me by email at elvistheultimatefanchannel@gmail.com or on Facebook and Twitter at Elvis the Ultimate Fan Channel. All my podcasts are available on all good podcast providers such as Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, Google Podcasts, Stitcher and iHeartRadio, to name just a few. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join me next time for another episode from Elvis the Ultimate Fan Channel podcast.